Okay, here we go. So, thank you. First of all, thank you so much to Justin and Hope and Ashley for organizing this event and for including me. I'm really happy to be here and to be talking about this. I know that the idea of personalized nutrition is a topic that a lot of people have questions and theories about. So, I think it's a really important thing to kind of dig into. So, a little bit about me. Justin shared I am the director of the Lifestyle Medicine Economic Research Consortium from ACLM, and my PhD is in nutritional epidemiology from Tufts Friedman School of Nutrition. So, I am a researcher, and I did previously work for Dr. T. Colin Campbell for many years, and that really influenced my thinking and my interest in doing research. And I think that, it's such a beautiful solution for human health, environmental health, and a compassionate lifestyle that a plant-based diet can really deliver all three of those things at the same time. So, my learning objectives for this talk today are to describe human nutritional needs, define and discuss the concept of an omnivore, discuss a selection of some of the popular diet trends that are out there that you've probably encountered, describe what a healthy diet is, and then, there are some considerations for eating a totally plant-based diet that are worth mentioning because people do have questions about them and they're worth paying attention to. And then just overall compare the health effects of an omnivorous versus totally plant-based diet. So, first, I want to get started by diving right into the framework for how we can think about what a healthy diet is. And it's important to start here, I think. The foundation is that nutritional needs are species specific. The National Academy of Sciences actually has a nutrition source book for a variety of different animals, including humans. And each species has specific needs, and there is variation, but it's really variation in the degree of a response, not so much in the direction. And what I mean by that is that people from like individual to individual are able to tolerate different levels of stress. And mental stress is one kind of stress, but physical trauma and nutritional assault by eating unhealthy foods on a regular basis are another kind of stress. So some people may be able to tolerate eating meat and eating processed food more than others without developing health problems from that. But that's not the same thing as some people needing to eat meat and others needing to eat a different kind of diet. It's really a variation in terms of the degree of response. So some people can handle more, and some people seem to need to be very strict, like people who've had a heart attack or some other cardiac event really may need to stick very closely to Dr. Esselstyn's very low-fat, totally plant-based diet. So the macronutrient recommendations for humans include about 10% protein, and it is based on an average requirement of 0.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, which translates to the recommended dietary allowance of zero 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. And at that level, almost the entire population would be getting enough or more than what they need. At least 6% essential fats and at least 130 grams of carbohydrate. Whole plant foods provide completely adequate intakes with a couple exceptions and really support superior health. And animal foods and refined or highly processed foods, on the other hand, really provide inadequate intakes of many nutrients, and they also increase risk for chronic disease. So the theme that I want to come back to at the end of this talk is that what we're going to talk about are dietary patterns that really support overall health. And it doesn't mean that you can eat whatever you want without thinking about anything. You do need to be intentional and make some choices to eat a healthy diet, even if it's a totally plant-based diet. But you need a lot less attention and you need to think about a lot fewer things than if a person is eating a diet that includes animal foods and other processed foods. So the question then becomes, well, some of these nutrients are good. Does that mean more is better? And more extra is not necessarily better. There is, again, a little bit of variation in terms of what people need as far as macronutrients or micronutrients, but a lot of this variation can be handled by the body through absorption and the kind of fine tunings that the metabolism takes care of when you eat food, depending on your need or what's happening or what your stores are of a particular nutrient. Optimal functioning really requires more study, but the best information we have now indicates that for the most part, simply getting enough of our requirements, meaning just meeting our needs, delivers the benefits that we want and need. If humans had vastly different nutritional requirements from person to person, it would just be difficult for that kind of situation to evolve because over time, natural selection causes the people who are getting the kind of diet and the nutrients that is most conducive to better health to survive and to reproduce. And so it would be difficult, I think, for vastly different nutritional requirements to evolve within the same species. Um, Getting extra doesn't really confer an added benefit. So this is a general statement. I think there are some subtleties when you talk about specific nutrients, but certainly with protein, this really applies. Getting extra really does not confer an added benefit, and it sometimes may confer an added risk. We'll get into more detail about that. Now, the definition of an omnivore, there are a few definitions you can find. American English says it's an organism that eats both plant and animal matter. British English defines it as an animal that naturally is able to eat both plants and meat. But I just want to point out that can does not necessarily mean should. And humans really have evolved to be opportunistic eaters. So it's not really in question that in our past, at some point, for probably most of our history, we were eating small amounts of meat, but these tended to be like smaller animals and some scavenging, and then there was some hunting. But really, the concept of man, the hunter, the great hunter, is a concept that developed in literature. It's not so much supported by anthropology or paleontological evidence. There is evidence that grain processing has been happening for about 30,000 plus years. So that is not so much a novelty of modern agriculture as some people claim, but it has been going on for a long time. But we lived in a changing food environment. So foraging was essential, and tubers and plant foods probably compose the bulk of our diet. But, we did evolve to be able to handle a variety of different foods because we needed to be able to do that in order to not starve. There's a picture here of Christina Warner, who's a dietary archaeologist, and she's delivering this TEDx talk that I really think is worth watching. It's kind of her rebuttal of the Paleo Diet, at least the modern take on the Paleo Diet that's being popularized now. And she has a lot of great points, and she's not necessarily a vegetarian or vegan person herself, but she is really critiquing it in a very intelligent way, and I think it's really worth taking a look at if you have time. It's less than 20 minutes. So I just want to point out that this opportunistic strategy that was essential for us in the past has really led to problems in the modern food environment. And this is a chart from the Dietary Guidelines. And, we can, leaving aside the fact that dairy is still in the Dietary Guidelines, there clearly are a lot of problems with the population intakes of certain types of foods. So about 3/4 of the population underconsume fruits and vegetables, and most people exceed the recommendations for sugars, saturated fats, and sodium. And the recommended limits for sugars and saturated fat are already quite a bit higher than what you'd get if you were eating a whole food plant-based diet. So in orange, you have the percent of the population that's either below the recommendation, so they're not getting enough, or they're above the limit. And blue are those who are at least getting what's recommended, or they're below the limit. So you can see for vegetables, fruits, oils, added sugars, saturated fats, and sodium, you have many fewer people that are eating outside of what's recommended than inside those recommendations. So that's a problem, and that's really a problem due to the modern food environment that people live in, and the foraging behavior that we engage in this environment is really non-functional for us because the foods that are available are calorie dense. There's tons of animal food and meat. There's added sugar, there's added salt in everything. We're tricked into overeating. We're tricked by advertising. It's a huge problem. And it's what leads to the very individual personal challenges that a lot of the people face with overweight. So a lot of people, I think, in response to this are choosing specific popular diets to kind of navigate these challenges. And there are a lot of fad-based diets that are emerging. Some are based on some scientific evidence, some not. But a lot of them are improvements on a standard American diet. So you have more fruits and vegetables, fewer processed, refined, or packaged food products, less sugar and white flour products, and reduced sodium because you're not eating processed foods. But many of them also do emphasize animal foods, which isn't really a direction supported by research that leads to better health. So that's where I think they're kind of going astray. But some of the ones that you've probably seen are like low carb, high protein diets, Atkins, zone, ketogenic. These kind of come and go, but there's a similar kind of theme here. And this cartoon is about somebody trying to order something at a fast food restaurant, and the person is shouting, "Oh, I'll have a high carb special," coming through. The person like wants potatoes in their French fries and so forth. There's the ketogenic diet, which is based on the idea is to induce the body into a state of ketosis, which is an emergency starvation strategy that the body will go into when you're not eating enough carbohydrate. Carbohydrate is the only food that the brain can really use as energy. When you don't have carbohydrates available, your body has to manufacture ketone bodies as a replacement for that. And there's less of a single brand here, but there's a list of approved foods and a list of foods to avoid. And like, unfortunately, some of the foods to avoid are things that actually are associated with better weight outcomes and health, such as fruit and beans or legumes. But it's good that, they're avoiding condiments and sauces that probably have a lot of sugar and salt. And it's good that they're avoiding like mayonnaise and alcohol. So, there's some positive attributes of some of these, but as I mentioned, ketosis is really the body's emergency strategy for starvation conditions. So the goal of most of these low-carb diets is to put the body into ketosis. And the brain really can't survive on protein or fat, and that's why these ketone bodies need to be produced to serve as carbohydrate substitutes. So it is associated with some reduced appetite, which aids in the weight loss, but it is a low-calorie diet, and that is what leads to the weight loss. It's a calorie-restricted way of eating. There are also sort of ancestral diets that are founded in the idea that our eating has veered off track compared to what we evolved to be eating, in quotations. And I put this in quotations because as I mentioned, the paleontological and archaeological evidence really does not support the idea that grains are very recent innovation. We really have seen evidence of people eating grains for quite a long time, well before the advent of modern agriculture. But some of them that you've seen here may be encountered. The biggest one is the Paleo Diet, and it does avoid processed foods, so that's good, but it also avoids grains, whole grains, and legumes, both of which are associated with a lot of improved health risk factors and some better weight outcomes. It does include meat, fish, eggs, and a variety of nuts and seeds, but it really emphasizes meat and fish and vegetables as the bulk of the diet. So in my humble opinion, the appeal of these fad diets is that they're cutting out the white bread, sugar, and the other processed foods and increasing the fruits and vegetables. So it helps a lot of people feel better. And I have heard people reporting anecdotally that they have better energy, their brain fog lifts, they have improved skin, better sleep, allergies and aches and pains get better. All of which I will point out are also things that people who switch to a whole food plant-based diet also report. And so I think many of these diets are easy to love for people because they still let you, quote unquote, eat animal foods and really fatty, rich foods. So people appreciate the improvements, but they stop there because, it's better than what they were eating, but they're not really thinking about where they can go from there. And so they think that's really the healthiest way. So I just want to have us reset our trajectory and our goal and just think about aiming for optimal, not just better. So what will best support your health and the health of the planet and a compassionate lifestyle? It's not just a diet that excludes processed foods. It's a diet that's really based on whole plant foods. A healthy diet is based on whole grains, legumes, fruits, greens, other vegetables, nuts, seeds, avocado, and olives in smaller amounts. And it avoids or excludes animal food like meat, poultry, eggs, fish, dairy products, and highly processed foods like sugar-sweetened beverages, flours, salty and sugary snacks, candy, etc. So this is really what we're talking about when we say a healthy dietary pattern. It's a plant-based diet, and there are a lot of health benefits that have been documented. They're substantial. So there's lower all-cause mortality among vegans as opposed to vegetarians or non-vegetarians. We've seen that excess animal protein is associated with higher risk for cancer, heart disease, and osteoporosis. plant foods contain antioxidants like phytochemicals and different vitamins, and animal foods don't contain any of those. So the more plant foods you eat, the more you can maximize your intake of those good substances. And then a really important thing about plant-based diets is that plant foods contain fiber, which animal foods don't. So diets naturally high in fiber are associated with lower rates of diabetes, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, obesity, various cancers, and other intermediate risk factors like high blood pressure, cholesterol, and high blood glucose. So there are a variety of both long-term and short-term benefits of making your diet be all about plant-based foods. And then, you know, we're going to take it one step further and talk about not just plant-based, but a completely plant-based diet or a vegan diet. And there are some common reasons for plant-based attrition or vegan attrition, as some people call it, people who've tried a totally plant-based diet and they felt like they had to stop. So some people report that they were tired or they just felt sluggish or they just didn't feel right, so they felt like they had to go back to eating meat. And it's really hard to address what's going on for an individual person without knowing what their nutrient levels are and really most importantly, what were they eating. But I can say there are two things that can be problematic. One is, in general, not eating enough food and not getting enough calories, so you're low on energy, and without realizing it, you can just be running on not enough cylinders. So if you are used to eating meat and you switch to a completely plant food diet, you do have to eat more volume to get the same amount of calories in order to fuel yourself. And some people really don't realize that. So they still eat the same portions, but they're just not getting enough food in. So that's one thing. The other thing is people can really eat too much bread and flour products and vegan treats and processed food. And it's just not necessarily a nutrient-dense diet, even though it's a plant-based diet. So you may just be feeling sluggish from that, or you may be missing certain nutrients because you're not really being intentional about taking B12 supplements, or maybe you need D. And all of this can be part of what causes people to feel like, oh, when I switched to the paleo diet, I felt better. But really what's happening is when they cut out processed foods and flour products, they felt a lot better. So it's important when you do eat a totally plant-based diet or any diet, not to rely too much on that stuff because it doesn't really lead to feeling optimal. So I do want to also mention that the position of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, so this is the professional organization for dietitians, they release every few years a position paper on vegetarian diets, and some of their statements include that well-planned vegetarian, including vegan diets, are healthful and nutritionally adequate. They may provide certain health benefits to the prevention and treatment of certain diseases, and they're appropriate for all stages of the life cycle. That includes pregnancy, lactation, infancy, childhood, adolescence, older adulthood, as well as athletes. So really, the optimal diet that we're talking about here is a completely plant-based diet, offers a variety of health benefits, is appropriate for everyone regardless of age, and you also do need to pay attention to a few things. Though again, many fewer than if you're eating an animal food-based diet. So there are these common yes but questions that I'd like to address. And really they are, will whole food plant-based diet provide enough protein, B12, vitamin D, calcium, and what about omega-3 fats? So we're going to tackle these one by one. First, though, I do just want to remind you that human diets are composed of food, not nutrients. We drink water, not hydrogen, and we eat sandwiches, not protein. So as much as I'm going to get a little bit detailed and specific here about some of these individual nutrients, I don't want you to get too swept up in the specifics, but remember that we're talking about a dietary pattern, and that's really the kind of viewpoint, I guess, that's most functional and will help you make good choices with what you're eating. I also want to remind us to say, there are these yes, but questions. Well, like, yes, but vegetarian diets reduce risk for cancer, but what about these other things? So don't forget to ask, is a whole food plant-based diet riskier than the alternative? The conversation has historically revolved around the inadequacies of whole food plant-based eating patterns or vegetarian diets, and that's what the rest of this lecture is going to address, because there are those questions, but I just want to remind you to think about what that assumption is. there are innate challenges with moderation and adequacy in eating a more typical Western diet. And those are people get too much fat, they get too much saturated fat, they get too much protein, especially animal protein, they get way too little fiber and far too few complex carbohydrates, and there are limited amounts of antioxidants, phytochemicals, and certain other micronutrients. So those are the pitfalls of the diet that most people are eating. So I think instead of asking, well, what about, omega-3 fats or B12, it's important to pay attention to all of that, which is what we're going to talk about. But I think the more helpful question is to then examine all the problems with the diet that people would typically be eating and say, well, looks like we're not doing so well here, so why don't we try this other diet, but just pay attention to what we're doing. Okay, so yes, let's answer those questions. So first, the big question, where do you get your protein? In a diet mostly or entirely based on a variety of whole plant foods with sufficient energy consumption, it's just impossible not to get enough protein. We will use math to understand why. So what is protein? It has a lot of functions. Cell growth and repair, cell signaling, enzymes are made of protein, and enzymes are messengers that regulate thousands of reactions in metabolism in the body. The recommended dietary allowance, or RDA, is 0.8 grams per kilogram. And at that level, again, about 98% of the population will be getting what they need or more than what they need. It's based on a normal curve and the top of the normal curve. Without protein, you do have problems, and the two main protein deficiency diseases are kwashiorkor, which is protein deficiency with adequate energy intake. So that means you're getting enough calories, but the foods that you're eating are too low in protein to deliver enough protein. So you see this in countries where particularly there's like a heavy reliance on cassava. So that's a very, very, very low protein food. And when you're not getting enough other foods also, you can tend to see this happen. And then marasmus is protein deficiency in the context of energy malnutrition. So that's starvation or undernutrition, not taking in enough food, and therefore not getting enough protein. What's the RDA for protein intake as a percent of energy? This is important because I think it's an easier way to think about how much protein you need and how to get that much. So the RDA is 0.8 grams per kilogram. That means for a 150-pound person, or 68.2 kilograms, eating about 2,000 calories per day, that's about 55 grams of protein recommended. I put required there, but it really should say recommended because, as I said, like 97.8% of people will be getting more than what they need with that. Protein is 4 kilocalories per gram. So 55 grams times 4 kilocalories is 220 calories from protein. So as a percent of energy out of a 2,000 kilocalorie diet, that's about 11% energy from protein. That's not a lot of protein. If you look at most plant foods, most of them are much more than, like many of them are more than 11% energy from protein. They're much more than 11%. And then many of them are, close to that. So when you look at all these greens and legumes, even tomatoes and oats, quinoa, even baked potatoes, everything from there up is more than 11% protein. And the plant foods that are below that, for the most part, fruit tends to be lower in protein, but even bananas are 5%. So when you're eating a variety of whole plant foods, it's really impossible not to, on average, consume more than 11% protein. Every time I've tracked my own intake, and I don't eat any animal food at all, and I've checked how much protein I'm getting, I don't try very hard to eat beans or anything in specific. I just eat a variety of foods, and of course that includes beans, salad, fruit, whole grains, etc. It's usually ended up at about 13 or 14% protein. So it's really quite easy. And the thing is, it has to be whole foods. As long as you're getting whole foods, like if someone's getting a lot of calories from soda, this does not work. But if we're talking about whole plant foods, it's really just impossible not to get enough. And I'm trying to advance the slide. Oh, okay. I have to go to my next section. Hold on one second. I have to go to part 2. This is the end of part 1. Select from library. Here we go. Okay. So The key message here is that it's inevitable. If you get enough energy from whole plant foods, you will get enough protein. Okay, moving on. What's the story with omega-3 fats? So omega-3 and omega-6 fats are the two essential fats humans have to consume. And getting enough omega-6s is rarely a problem because they're present in almost all foods. And most people in this country do eat added oils, which are mostly like canola oil, etc., omega-6 oils. So the richest sources of omega-3 fats, which is kind of more of a hot topic because people are very interested in them, because they are associated with lower risk of cardiovascular disease, are vegetables and vegetable oils, walnuts, flax seeds and chia seeds, soybeans, and then cold water fish like salmon or sardines. So this is where the recommendation to eat fatty fish comes from for omega-3 fats. If you have inadequate omega-6 fats, you can get skin problems, but it's very rare. This is like hardly ever seen, especially in this country. With with total fat, there's no recommendation for total fat. It's really fine to eat a very low-fat diet, but there are some guidelines for reducing, that should say, CVD risk. The Dietary Guidelines say you should keep your saturated fat to less than 10%. The American Heart Association says less than 5 or 6%. This is really easy with a plant-based diet, unless you're eating too much coconut or palm oil products. It's very easy to be less than 5 or 6%. But anyway, the RDA, or adequate intake for omega-6 fats, is men 17 grams and women 12 grams. And AMDR stands for acceptable macronutrient distribution range. So that's a range that you can assign to say, well, within this range, it really should be fine. 5 to 10% of calories. And then you really need very small amounts of omega-3 fats. For men, that's 1.6 grams per day, and women 1.1. And it's really like less than 1.5% of your total calories. So saturated fat is extremely low or non-existent in plant foods, with the exception of coconut or palm oil. But meat and cheese are the main sources of saturated fat. And if you consume a diet largely based on whole plant foods, it's not a problem to avoid saturated fat. The reason people are so interested in omega-3 fats is because these shorter chain fats are converted to long chain fats, which we need. And the long chain fats are associated with health benefits, particularly reducing cardiovascular disease. So we're not really sure how efficient the conversion is. It's influenced by the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fats, as well as the total fat intake. So low total fat may be better, and a ratio of 2 to 4 omega-6s for every 1 omega-3 may be better. I think people used to be more certain about this, but I think it's still under a lot of study. But we need more research to determine what these exact conversion ratios are. However, the fish sources of omega-3 fats, they're already, like, the fats from fish are already in the long form of EPA and DHA, which is like the end product in our bodies that we end up producing. So that's why people are so into fish, because they have these fats that on their own are associated with lower risk of cardiovascular disease. But cold water fish and fish oil, so they are the richest sources of these two fats, but when you eat them, it means you're also ingesting PCBs and pollutants, and it can actually be very easy to exceed the daily limits for toxicity. So plants are a much safer source, and it's possible to increase your intake of short-chain omega-3 fats, which then get converted to the long-chain fats, EPA and DHA. You would eat flaxseed, walnuts, chia seeds. You could also reduce your total fat intake to possibly help that conversion process. But you may want to think about taking an algae-based EPA DHA supplement. And I think especially for pregnant and lactating women, this is probably a good idea. And then you avoid all the pollutants that are found in fish, as well as not eating fish. So the plant sources of omega-3 fats: in flaxseed, about a tablespoon, you get 2.35 grams of ALA. Chia seeds, even more. Walnuts, tofu, and seaweed. So here, what I'm talking about are the ALA omega-3 fats. These are not the end products, not the same thing as EPA and DHA. And that's why you also probably want to consider maybe taking an algae supplement to deliver that EPA and DHA that would be the direct substitute for eating fish without the pollutants. Okay, so B12, next big question. B12 is a water-soluble essential nutrient. It's important in nerve function, healthy blood cells, DNA synthesis. It has a lot of jobs. it is produced by bacteria in the soil. It's not something that animal flesh produces endemically. Animal foods contain B12 because animals eat these bacteria during their lifetimes by consuming plants that have dirt on them. And so then the B12 ends up in their blood and muscle. And the RDA is very small for adults. It's 2.4 micrograms, both for men and women. It is a really good idea to get a blood test from your doctor to check your levels. I always do every year because I like to know how I'm doing with B12 and D. And B12 fortified foods and supplements are just a good idea. So if you do consume a totally plant-based diet for several years, your blood work's going to look great. You're going to have very low cholesterol, very low blood pressure. You're probably going to be a normal weight. You may be at risk of deficiency of B12 if you're not taking a supplement. And I should point out too that supplementation in the US is actually advised for everyone eating a totally plant-based diet, as well as all older adults, whatever their diets are, because you gradually have a harder time absorbing B12 as you get older. So there are fortified foods that contain B12. A lot of plant milks do. Nutritional yeast can be fortified. Some breakfast cereal is, although I don't think that's a great healthy food to eat a lot of. Nori has some. Wild mushrooms that have been exposed to UV light. Actually, that's vitamin D. Anyway, there's some options from food, but it's really not a sure thing to rely on just foods. It's better to take a supplement. And food sources are just probably not enough to ensure adequate intake. But B12 is water soluble, so overconsumption is not really a concern. And again, I would just always get your blood work done every year. I think that it's fun to get information about yourself and your health. And these choices about supplementation should really be made in the context of knowing what's going on in your own body. It's not, supplementation shouldn't be taken like lightly. You should think of it as more like medicine than food, and really make that decision maybe with your doctor or maybe on your own. But for things like vitamin D and B12, you want to know what's happening so you can monitor that. So take a supplement. All right, vitamin D. Vitamin D is another hot topic that people want to know about because cow's milk in the US is fortified with vitamin D. And that, along with certain fatty fish, are really the richest food sources of vitamin D that people consume. I will point out that cow's milk is not naturally high in vitamin D. It's fortified anyway, so that's why people are getting a lot of it there. It's a conditionally essential nutrient. It's a hormone produced by the skin in response to UVB exposure. And UVB radiation is usually released between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. If you have an iPhone and you have a weather app, it will usually show you the UV index. So you want to see a UV index of 3 or more, and that indicates that there's some UVB exposure happening. If it's less than 3, I think you can still tan a little bit, but that doesn't mean that you're producing vitamin D. So you're not really necessarily getting anything out of the sun exposure unless the UVB index is 3 or greater. Vitamin D has a lot of important roles, particularly with regulating calcium and phosphorus absorption. It's integral to bone health. And it's not found in most foods, except, as I mentioned, fatty fish and fortified cow's milk. People who have darker skin or with little sun exposure and people who live farther from the equator may need a vitamin D supplement, and blood tests are the best way to identify deficiency or low levels. So again, I really recommend getting blood work done every year. And I'll just revisit my theme. Like, all of these things I'm recommending are ways to ensure that you're really on top of your diet and your health. But I wish that everyone was doing all this stuff, even if they weren't thinking about eating a totally plant-based diet, because the people who are eating diets that include meat and cheese and soda, they, really, they're typically finding as they get older, there's more and more suggestion to take medications for chronic conditions, and they may have certain nutrients that they're low on, and really we should all be paying this much attention to our diet. So vitamin D sources, sunlight is really best if you can manage to get enough of it. But the fatty fish and fortified cow's milk contain D. But then again, I'll just point out that if you consume fish, there's a host of risks related to PCBs and pollutants. And cow's milk is a common allergen. And dairy protein is really not necessary or helpful in health. So taking a D3 supplement is probably advised when vitamin D levels are low, no matter what diet you're eating. But again, if you can make that decision knowing what your levels are, that's the best way to do that. Okay, calcium is another question people ask about. It is an essential structural component of bone, and you need it for vascular contraction, vasodilation, which means your blood vessels contracting and dilating, muscle function, nerve transmission, intracellular signaling, hormonal secretion. It has lots of jobs. And the RDA, the recommended dietary allowance for people from 18 to 50 years old, is 1,000 milligrams per day for men and women. That's pretty high compared to what is actually consumed in a lot of other countries. And there is a paradox that's been noted that hip fractures are actually higher in developed countries where calcium intakes are higher. And there may be some interaction with protein, especially animal protein. This is like the results are very inconsistent about these relationships. So I think the take-home message is that eating more calcium does not necessarily protect you for sure against bone breaks. But I think that, as people are studying this more, there's a lot of epidemiological evidence that has conflicting results about the supposed effects of dairy products, although people are encouraged to eat dairy products to supposedly prevent breaks. But calcium intake varies a lot by country. It's closely aligned with animal and dairy food intake. And, they're very different levels of animal food intake from developed to developing countries. So absorption also varies with intake, but really it's a huge topic. So my best summary statement for calcium is you should all read this book by Dr. Amy Lanoux, Building Bone Vitality. You can get it on Amazon. She's really gone into a lot of detail about all the research and all the claims about dairy products and osteoporosis and bone health, and really debunked it and delivered a good summary of the consistent patterns that are seen and those that are not. So I think this is the best recommendation I can give on the topic of calcium, is to read this book. And I'm at the end of part 2. Okay, let me go on to part 3. Hold on one second. Let's see here. All right. Okay, so just to sum up, these are the nutrients of public health concern from the U.S. Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. So there are these shortfall nutrients, meaning most Americans are not getting enough of these nutrients. And those are vitamins A, D, E. Vitamin D, even though people drink fortified cow's milk. E, folate, vitamin C, folate for women of childbearing age, vitamin C, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and fiber, as well as iron for adolescents and premenopausal women. They're overconsumed nutrients, sodium, and saturated fat. So we've talked about some of the shortfall nutrients, or in that we talked about D and calcium, but most of these other nutrients are actually really easy to get eating a plant food diet, so much so that you really would never run into a problem with them. And that includes A, E, folate, C, magnesium, potassium, fiber, and iron, as long as you're emphasizing greens and tofu, and iron really is not a problem for the most part either. So the overconsumed nutrients, sodium can still be a problem if you eat a lot of processed foods, but if you're eating whole foods, it's not a problem. And saturated fat, again, as long as you're not overdoing the coconut and the palm oil. So I'm just going to talk about a couple other nutrients that whole food plant-based diets really deliver in abundance very easily. So there's fiber. It's incredibly important. It's an indigestible carbohydrate. There's soluble and insoluble. The adequate intake is 25 grams a day per women and 38 for men, but that's based on 14 grams per 1,000 kilocalories. If you don't get enough fiber, you can have constipation. You can have a tendency to overeat, which leads to an increased risk of obesity because your stomach isn't full with material. Fiber provides bulk, so it triggers your satiety receptors. And it's also a lack of fiber is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease, certain cancers, and type 2 diabetes. And again, it's only found in plant foods. So most people in the US really don't get enough fiber, which is incredible because the recommendation is not even that high. The people who were doing the best were the vegans in the Seventh-day Adventist cohort study. even more than the semi-vegetarians. Typical U.S. consumptions are around 17 or 18 grams, which just really is not enough. So eating a plant-based diet is the way to go. Another overconsumed nutrient in typical diets is sodium. The adequate intake is 1,500 milligrams per day, and the upper limit, UL, is 2,300 milligrams per day. Most Americans get about 3,200 milligrams per day, about 1,000 more than we need, a lot of it from prepared food. Jeff Novick, registered dietitian, has a really useful rule of thumb here that I love. Just look at the calories and then look at the milligrams of sodium. Try to choose foods where the milligrams of sodium per serving is no more than the calories per serving, because people really shouldn't have more than about 2,300 milligrams of sodium. If you're eating about 2,000 calories per day, that kind of works out to be approximately the same number. It's a good rule of thumb. You'll notice if you look at like canned soups, a lot of salad dressings, any candy, sauces, even bread, the amount of sodium in some of these things is humongous, and it's really concerning when you're eating so much you don't notice it. So if you apply this to food labels, you'll really start to see that eating foods that don't come in a package are probably the best way to apply this rule. All right, so the key takeaways are eating well requires some attention and planning, again, but eating a whole food plant-based diet does not mean you can eat anything you want without making intentional decisions, but many do find it easier to stay well, avoid disease, maintain a healthy weight, lose weight. Eating an omnivorous diet by default means you're going to be consuming protein, fat, and saturated fat in excess of requirements. Excess really means overconsumption, and excess leads to an increased risk of chronic disease. Eating a whole food plant-based diet is more likely to deliver adequate intakes of essential nutrients with maybe some B12 and D supplements, and it also provides a nutrient composition that's far more likely to minimize risk of chronic disease than any omnivorous diet out there. So, it's the best thing you can do for your health. It also has all these other benefits at the same time of being environmentally friendly and compassionate. And there really is not a lot of evidence that some people need meat and others don't. There is a lot of evidence that anyone who eats more plant foods, even to the point of no animal foods at all, will be at a lower risk of chronic disease and will really be just in the best position for ensuring a long, healthy life with great longevity. Remember that it's about food. We talked a lot about nutrients because people have these questions about, what about if I don't eat this or that? But remember that eating a healthy diet means making choices to eat food and not eat other foods. So eating whole fruits, vegetables, legumes, small amounts of nuts and seeds, including avocado and olives, and occasionally coconut is all good. Avoiding meat, fish, eggs, dairy, and other processed foods are really the foods to avoid to put yourself in the best bracket for low rates of cancer, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, other metabolic problems, overweight as you age, all of these health benefits. And that's the end, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Micaela. That was great.
Thanks, Justin.
Yeah, hey, I'm back. I was popping in and out. So we actually did have a few questions come up during the chat, and I'll read some of them for the attendees. So one was actually, what's your take on the oil-free diets?
I think that it depends on who you're talking about. If someone has a history of heart disease themselves, or especially if a person is overweight and they kind of struggle with overeating and food addiction, or they're trying to lose weight, an oil-free diet may be really needed for that person. Dr. Estelson would say nobody should ever eat oil, and it's not, it just doesn't fit into his definition of a healthy diet at all. He's working with very sick patients, so it's definitely applicable to those people. For other people, especially athletes, if someone is like an elite athlete and they're working out 6 or 8 hours a day and they're they need to eat like 5,000 calories or more to maintain their weight, I think it's hard to do that if you don't eat oil. For people who are just healthy and active, oil is not necessary. We really don't need a lot of fat to be getting enough fat. I think that the research hasn't been done comparing people eating no oil to a little bit of oil to moderate amounts in the context of like everyone eating a vegan or a whole food plant-based diet. So I don't know. I think that like for me, I try to avoid eating oil. When I go out to a restaurant, I don't really worry about it because it's difficult, but I don't cook with oil at home. I think it depends. But I will say for people who are trying to lose weight, if you cut out oil, the weight just melts away. It's like magic. So it is the most calorie dense food, and it doesn't make you feel full in comparison to how many calories it delivers.
Great. Yeah, lots of questions, it seems, about oils and fats. So some other folks were also asking about if you had recommendations on like best oils, and also in terms of like, like fatty oils and like nuts and seeds and stuff. Like if, we hear lots of really good things about like walnuts, but where would something like peanuts or almonds, compare in terms of like, as a source of fats and nutrients?
So like I said, when we were talking about omega-3 fats, flaxseed, chia seeds, and walnuts have significantly more omega-3 fats, which are those essential fats that we need to consume, than the other nuts and seeds. So I would always prioritize eating those things. My rule of thumb about nuts and seeds is I try not to eat them as a food on their own. Like I would never snack on a handful of nuts, but I put nuts on things as condiments, and I will put them in like salad dressings to make it creamy or a little bit richer without adding oil, or in sauces, or like in a grain salad or something. I personally am one of those people that would be struggling a lot with my weight if I did not eliminate most oils. So I do have to be careful about eating too many nuts. Somebody who is a lot more active than me, or they just have a faster metabolism, probably can eat more nuts and not have a problem. But yeah, like it's good to eat a variety of foods and not worry about it too much. But I would, if you're going to prioritize nuts, I would prioritize, and seeds, I would prioritize flaxseed, chia, and walnuts. And then if you want to add in, peanuts, pumpkin seeds, almonds, like all of them in little bits here and there, put in your oatmeal, throw some in a salad, but like don't eat too many, and don't keep them in the car as a food to snack on. I think you'll be in good shape.
Great. Yeah, rancid oils are a big deal. So actually, this is an interesting question that I'd love to get your take on. So someone was asking, saying that their friend is on a paleo diet,
Mm-hmm.
and they say that they're on that paleo diet in order to prevent diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a concern that transitioning to a plant-based diet might maybe increase the risk of diabetes or make them more likely to get diabetes. I wanted to know, or they wanted to know, like if you had any thoughts on that, on somebody who's doing paleo to prevent diabetes transitioning to plant-based.
Yeah, it's hard to answer these kinds of questions about a specific person without like knowing who they are and what their specific relationship is. I know that when people do switch to like Dr. Esselstyn's diet, if they're eating a lot of fruit, their blood sugars can go up a little bit. They can be a little high. And that can be sort of a red flag or concern with people who are trying to maybe reverse prediabetes, or they're trying to avoid diabetes. So that may be why they feel concerned about a plant-based diet. There's a whole school of thought about like low carb diets and how that can prevent blood sugar spikes. And I think that really we know that populations around the world that eat mostly plant foods and whole foods have very low rates of diabetes. So we don't have any large populations eating a low carbohydrate diet like the paleo diet. The populations that are eating like indigenous type diets, for the most part, it is mostly plant foods, and they do have low rates of diabetes. So I don't know. I think that's a really big topic to get into. I'm not sure I can address it well here, but it could be that that person also maybe was suggested to eat a paleo diet by their doctor, and that makes it even more tricky to kind of get into. I'm sorry, that's not a very satisfying answer, but I just feel like without knowing the person and I don't know. I don't think I can like fully address that here. I just know that one thing that people may be concerned about with plant food diets is if you do eat a ton of fruit, it can raise your blood sugars a little bit. So particularly if that's a concern, like people have found that limiting fruit is better and eating more vegetables and like non-sugary things, even if it's natural sugars, may be a better idea.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I know these nutrition questions can get a little bit detailed sometimes, and it can be hard. But thanks for fielding that. So one other question I noticed is so somebody was asking about they've heard that plant-based sources of omega-3 fatty acids are not as beneficial in the body as those from animal sources. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, and I'm sorry if this didn't come through clearly when I was talking about this earlier, but so what that's about is we can get ALA. I'm not going to say the whole name of the fat, but the abbreviation is ALA, omega-3 fats from chia, flax, and walnuts, and some vegetable, like they're in vegetables, vegetable fats and vegetable oils. So those fats are converted in the body into these long chain omega-3 fats, and that includes EPA and DHA. And the blood levels of EPA and DHA are associated with lower rates of cardiovascular disease. So that's why people are interested in those end products of EPA and DHA, and those are not found in plants. Those are found in fish, but it's also found in algae. So what I was trying to explain earlier was that there are a lot of factors that affect that conversion process from ALA to the end products of EPA and DHA. Some of those factors are how much total fat you're eating and what the ratio is of omega-3 to omega-6 fats. But if you're interested in getting higher blood levels of EPA and DHA, just like you would get from eating fish, I think the safest way to get those is through an algae supplement. And there are algae supplements that contain, you can read it on the label, they are EPA and DHA fats.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I've actually taken some of those myself. They're pretty neat. So, good. Yeah. Okay, so let's see. We have about 5 more minutes. So if you have a little more time to maybe field a few more questions.
Sure. Yeah, that's fine.
So this one probably is pretty quick. People have said that the B12 contained in spirulina is an analog, like a B12 analog, and so it doesn't actually provide any B12 in the diet. Is that true? Is that not a true source of?
Yeah, that's a good question. I just noticed that too. I will check. I'm not sure, but either way, I don't think you can get enough B12 from food. So I think taking a supplement is important. And if you are taking a supplement, you would not need to worry about it.
Great. And then actually the diabetes question just came up. Do you have any specific recommendations for people who are diabetic and pre-diabetic who are on vegan diets? I mean, I know you mentioned not eating fruit, too much fruit and stuff, but any other specific recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, I think my first specific recommendation is to hopefully find a physician that you can work with who's familiar with the plant-based diet. And I would recommend visiting plantbaseddocs.org. It's a website put on by the Plantation Project, and they have a map of plant-based doctors who are in just in their website network. They're not vetted, but I think that you should try, if possible, to work with a physician who knows what you're doing. And then I'm not a physician, so I'm not telling you what to do, but I can say from working with many physicians, most of them do report that when the person goes on a very low-fat diet, so that does include cutting out added oils and not eating too much fruit either, the blood sugars do tend to stabilize very quickly, and people seem to become insulin sensitive again. So again, I'm not telling that person what to do, but that's what the physicians who work with diabetic patients say happens. But I would try to find a physician, hopefully, that you can talk to. And if you can't find one near you who's to become their patient, I would also recommend maybe calling the True North Health Center. Their website is healthpromoting.com, and I think you can do a phone consultation with them, and they can at least give you some background and some context after, it's not like a telemedicine appointment, but it's a consultation, and that can be very helpful.
Okay, cool. And then do you have any thoughts about oil-free diet? I think you mentioned oil-free diets, but sorry, like a ketogenic, I know you had a slide about that, but the ketogenic plant-based diet? You see anything about that?
I guess that would be a diet that's like a lot of nuts. I think it would be hard to actually induce ketosis in the body eating only plant foods because you need to be consuming less than that requirement of 130 grams of carbohydrate per day in order to induce ketosis. I think there are some diets where people think they're going into ketosis because it's maybe like less grains or carbohydrates than they're used to. But you really have to restrict a lot to actually do that. And then if you do, that's not a long-term diet anyone can maintain. That's can be pretty damaging in the long term. So I don't know what the benefit would be of a ketogenic plant-based diet. I think you can get all the benefits you need from just a plant-based diet. But again, if like blood sugars are a concern for a person, they may really want to limit the fruit and definitely no juice. Like no one should eat juice anyway. It's really like soda, not fruit. But focusing on vegetables and more like lower glycemic foods is probably the good idea.
Gotcha. Okay. And then someone was asking if you could repeat the website that you mentioned for getting finding doctors.
Yes, I will actually type it into the chat. It's plantbaseddocs.org. And then the True North Health Center is the medically supervised water fasting clinic in Santa Rosa, California. Their website is healthpromoting.com, and they're the ones that I would recommend talking to them if you can't find a plant-based doctor in your area.
Okay, great. Awesome. Well, looks like it's about 3 o'clock, so wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time to present and answer questions. Yeah, it was super informative, so thank you so much.
You're welcome, Justin. Thank you, and good luck with the rest of the summit.
Thanks, and thanks, everybody.